The question I'm asking is, where does history happen?
You mobilise that language then of bridging between location or place, education, technology, other types of bridging work.
Hi everyone, my name is Dominic Smith and I'm a Senior Lecturer in Philosophy at the University of Dundee in Scotland. We're here today on this University of Minnesota podcast to discuss my book, Bridging Benjamin, A Philosophy of Technology, Place and Education, which was published by the press in March 2026. Before we go any further, I'd like to thank my colleagues for doing this podcast with me. So Maggie Sattler from the press and Esther Leslie, the esteemed media theorist. I'm very grateful to them both for helping with this podcast. So just a little bit of background. I should say that my work to date has been at the intersection of philosophy of technology and continental philosophy, continental European philosophy. And my background is in French philosophy, so specifically the work of Gilles Deleuze. In 2018, I published a book called Exceptional Technologies, a Continental Philosophy of Technology. In that book, the thinker who's the focus of the book we're going to discuss today, namely the German philosopher and critic Walter Benjamin, features precisely once in the previous book, as part of a footnote where I worry about thinkers who seem unplaceable in the history of philosophy of technology. So I think that the book we're going to discuss today addresses something that was lacking in my previous book. So whereas Exceptional Technologies provides a fairly survey-like argument for a concept of technologies that subvert our preconceptions about technology, what I mean by exceptional technologies are impossible ones, merely imagined ones, and failed ones, for instance. I think that book lacked the kind of propulsion and specificity of a story that we might be able to get our teeth into. And I hope that I've addressed something of that in the book we're going to discuss today, Bridging Benjamin. Just to give you a sense of where it came from, the book started out on a very dumb premise of taking up a completely sheer contingency as a guiding necessity and trying to generate philosophical possibilities out of it. So the contingency is that Walter Benjamin wrote a radio piece that Esther knows very well about a famous rail disaster that occurred in Dundee, the city where I live and work. And I took this up as my inspiration to look at Walter Benjamin's radio work in the round more broadly. What I found is that there's a lot of potential, and I've tried to channel that through the themes mentioned in the title to the book, so technology, place and education. In the book, there are 2 chapters devoted to each of those themes. So taking up that kind of dumb premise, I wanted to just push the sense of kind of stupefied wonder that I had in the face of this little fragment and turn it into something more philosophically accessible and not just kind of completely my own private concern alone. With that intro done, I just invite Esther to fire some questions at me.
Hi there, my name's Esther Leslie. I'm Professor of Political Aesthetics at Birkbeck, the University of London, and I've written about Benjamin in the past. In fact, my PhD a million years ago was on Benjamin's renderings of technology, although less, I suppose, from a strictly philosophical point of view and more from a cultural and theoretical point of view. So I was delighted and intrigued and challenged by this marvelous book when it landed with me. And I want to spend some time just picking up on some of the themes and probing Dominic's ideas. I mean, it's a very rich book, which has so many different implications around ideas of media and technology and pedagogy and education, how we think about location. It talks about contemporary technologies and older technologies. My first question, though, is just a little one, which is, within Dundee, this rail disaster that happened, 100 and X years ago is very well known, and the children know about it, and it's part of the mythos of the town. Had you thought about it philosophically before re-encountering the story in Benjamin and setting yourself this challenge?
Well, thanks so much, Esther. And the short answer is no. For kind of institutional reasons and reasons to do that are to do with things that are kind of very ingrained in the history of the city. We're Scotland's fourth largest city, so we're quite a minor point on the map, globally speaking. And what really blew my mind about this piece was it offered something from the outside that it brought inside to this understanding that people share of this famous disaster. So the disaster in question, it occurred in 1879 to a train coming from Edinburgh to Dundee in between Christmas and New Year. And what happened is that the bridge collapsed and all the people on the train were lost. And what's quite interesting is that locally, it's something that children encounter through, as you say, the mythos. That's the perfect word for it. Through kind of a cultural osmosis, on the one hand, through grandparents perhaps talking about the disaster, the replacement bridge that was built after the disaster, and how they perhaps experienced that in the culture of Dundee. And it's also a very visible landmark. If you stand atop the hill in the centre of Dundee, you can't avoid this bridge. So there's this sense of it being this kind of shared artefact. And the way that gets cashed out beyond mythos is in curriculum. Because what we find in the schools locally is that it's taught as an item of local history. So when the initial bridge fell, it was the longest bridge in the world. It is quite strange to think that a town like Dundee at that point would have had the longest bridge in the world. But it says a lot about the industrial culture of the city and specifically about textiles and how they invested in infrastructure. It's often thought of as shared part of local culture, but also part of the curriculum. And I hadn't reflected on the fact that there was so much in the way of philosophical potential in precisely that awareness that people had. But on reflection, and I think this is what Benjamin opened my eyes to, what he made me think is that people in Dundee know this story inside out. What would it be like to give those people the voice of an outsider on this event, and what could they make of it? And I think when you put it in those terms, you start to see that all sorts of philosophical things come out of the little radio broadcast he gave about the Taybridge disaster. What he's asking in some ways is, when do we most think about technology? And his answer, consistent with a great many philosophers of technology, is that we do that when it breaks. But unlike Martin Heidegger, who would talk about a broken hammer, always using the indefinite article, a broken hammer, what Benjamin does is he says, let's talk about this bridge, this very specific bridge, and the history that surrounds it. And let's see how accessible that could be to both to people who know the story and who don't. So the short answer is I hadn't thought about it philosophically, but having read the 5 pages of Benjamin's TypeScript, I thought it saw it in you as something that was like this little material thought experiment, which is beautiful. If you think about how philosophy often gets taught in the curriculum, it can be to do with the most abstract thought experiments, the grandfather paradox or paradoxes about twins. What you had here was just something much richer, I felt.
Yeah, I mean, what you take from it is itself a marvelous text, and what you take from it is so wonderful. It opens it up in so many ways, and you make bridges out of it. And your book is about much, much more than that single short text, but it does produce a vocabulary that goes into the title, Bridging Benjamin.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or Benjamin, we never know
Yeah.
how to say him when we're on English language podcasts. But also a kind of language of derailment and parallel tracks and so on. Could you talk about some of the ways in which you mobilize that language then of bridging, the bridges between location or place, education, technology, other types of bridging work that you're doing through the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the introduction, I talk about this and I make the claim that Benjamin's radio broadcasts, of which we possess no recordings, we should underline, we only have the typescripts, so the written typescripts. And my claim is that these are his bridges. And what I mean by that is that what I took from the very close attention to the details of the Teo rail bridge piece is that for Benjamin, any bridge or any act of mediation is always cracked. There's always something cracked or broken about it. Whether that's merely the possibility of something breaking, that's nevertheless something that still haunts the artifact or phenomenon in question. So what I found broken about these bridges is, we've got these 93 instances of radio broadcasts. He duplicated some of the broadcasts, so we've got a more limited set of typescripts, but there's something fascinatingly broken about these bridges in the sense that we've only got the texts and not the audio pieces. I wanted to kind of think about the broadcasts as bridges in their broken form, and attending to that theme, the three themes of the title suggested themselves. I cashed these out in particular ways, given the limitations of the size of the book. I suppose Benjamin, as you've mentioned, reference to your own work, is known for his work on technology. His most famous essay on the work of art in the age of its mechanical reproducibility, for instance, or technological reproducibility, is canonical across all sorts of areas of academic endeavour, critical theory, law, art and media studies. What I find quite interesting is the disjunct between that fact and the fact that Benjamin features basically as not even a footnote in the emerging, quite fashionable discipline of philosophy of technology. And I think this is attested to by the kind of paucity of references to Benjamin's work in the most high-profile course books in that field. One way of tracking that in the book is to compare that to the situation of Martin Heidegger, who was his contemporary and who he shared lecture theatres with in Freiburg very early in his academic career. In some of the big textbooks in philosophy of technology, there are entire sections devoted to Heidegger, but nothing to Benjamin. The first theme in the title of the book, the first thought was to try and derail our understanding of technology or philosophy of technology in favour of introducing Benjamin into this field. I suppose education would be another theme that features there in the title. What I wanted to do there was maybe shift the focus. In your own writings, for instance, you've engaged with Benjamin's work in education in the German student movement, for instance, and he's often associated with that in his kind of late 19-teens to early 1920s work. And then there's also a lot of work on the critique of violence essay that he wrote in 1921 in connection with education. What I saw in those bridges, those broken bridges of the radio pieces, was a kind of both a kind of a type of pedagogy and almost a kind of program, an educational program. I wouldn't go so far as to say curriculum because I think it's something other. So that's the sense in which I wanted to kind of distort or perturb that theme of education. And if you permit me, the other theme of place, I think, is maybe the most interesting one in the title of the book, or the least obvious one. The obvious theme, if you were thinking about big themes surrounding Benjamin to choose for the title, would be history. So thinking about how Benjamin in the Arcades project offers a particular view of the history of the 19th century through the Paris Arcades. And then very famously, his last written piece is on the concept of history. And it starts with this famous image of the angel of history looking back over progress and just seeing it as a field of ruins. The reason that I haven't focused on history is I think that the question I'm asking is, where does history happen? So what's quite interesting in Benjamin's broadcasts is that they bridge these themes of history and place. And I don't think this has been kind of stressed enough. In his later broadcasts, specifically those are in and around the Tay Bridge piece, he's making reference to events, but also to the places where they occur. So the eruption of Vesuvius, or the Lisbon earthquake, or a theatre fire in Canton. In the reception of Benjamin, there's been a big emphasis on this thought about catastrophe, and specifically as we approach the catastrophe of Germany in the 1930s. And Benjamin's life bears tragic witness to that. But what that underplays is this thought about these events occurring somewhere. And to get back to your original point about how I take up the metaphor of the bridge, well, that's what a bridge does. It occurs somewhere and does a very specific type of mediation that's fraught with danger, the potential for catastrophe, etc. So I suppose I've summarised those three themes, and the answer as to why the radio works are useful, I think they just allow these themes to be expressed in quite a powerful way.
I find that very illuminating. What you said about the specificity of this bridge or this location compared to Heidegger's sort of gesturing towards a wooden bridge. But also, even within the text, though, it's not necessarily about intimacy, because, as you say, what fascinates you about Benjamin thinking about the Tay Bridge is that it's imagined, or he encounters it in a poem. So it's a kind of imagined place, and that's also a bridge between sort of the fantastic and the actual. Or I mean, what would you say about that? Whether a place is concretely known to you, or whether it's a place of imagination? How does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the kind of middle chapters of the book, I tried to draw this out, hopefully not in too artificial a way, by thinking through these themes of actuality. When and why do specific places become problematic or philosophically engaging for us? And then virtuality, so that this thought about merely imagined places or exercises in world building. What's fascinating is that you can see each of these dynamics in Benjamin's radio work. So, I've mentioned what I call a kind of catastrophe constellation of works, which occurs towards the second half of his radio work, where he's duplicating his broadcasts. He's doing these broadcasts between Frankfurt and Berlin. In his early work, he tends to separate the themes, so he does Berlin themes for Berlin and Frankfurt themes for Frankfurt. But what's quite interesting in these catastrophe constellations is that he finds ways of duplicating these broadcasts. So the Tay Bridge piece, for instance, is a piece that he gave for both Frankfurt and Berlin. So there's something really delightful about this, because I think he's speaking to the audiences of Berlin in a way that says, what happens if you reflect on an elsewhere? So this notion of an unvisited small city on the coast of Scotland, and you get into poignant issues about what kind of an elsewhere that might have been for a suffering Jewish academic in the 1930s in Germany, knowing that radio, for instance, is about to be reformed and centralized, and that he's about to lose this stream of income, for instance. So I think he does really powerful things with this exercise in engaging place as actual, and also expanding a concept of it through the kind of haunting possibilities of both storytelling. I would speculate through the possibilities of audio and through the exercises in listening that build a sense of world phenomenologically. And then going even further, you can see that he engages kind of exercises in creative writing. And so he, also, in addition to these broadcasts about historical events, he's creating little radio plays. So three specifically, two that were broadcast and one that was commissioned, written, and not broadcast. And in these pieces, he does the most fascinating things with our sense of place and how we access it. In one of them, for instance, there's basically a thought experiment in disembodiment, and so he's asking us to think about, can our sense of personhood go on without place? And this is in a play where he refers to voiceland, this purely audible domain.
Yeah, and also, I mean, one of the things you evoke, I think, in relation to this is this sense of audience. So and this recognition of venue. So there's one point in the book where you're contrasting Martin Heidegger delivering a lecture in a particular place with an audience in front of him, and thinking about the differences between that mode of delivery and Benjamin going into a radio studio broadcasting to maybe no people, 10 people, hundreds, thousands, this sort of imagined um, audience. So there's something that's recurrent throughout the book about this idea of sort of presence and absence, which also revolves around your speculations on what it would mean to have recordings of the voice of Benjamin. Would this give us more or different kind of access? So yeah, what would you say about that sort of sense of a presence, metaphysics of presence, imagined audiences, absent audiences? How does this work on to the reception and the production of what is delivered?
Yeah, so in preparing the book for the press, and one of the things I started to think about a lot and worry about was, well, what if they discovered recordings of Benjamin's broadcasts? Would that completely scuttle this book? And aside from maybe one night of kind of sleepless worry about this issue, I think I've kind of put it aside because I started to ask myself, so we only have the typescripts, and suppose one of the broadcasts were found tomorrow. Suppose a whole set. Suppose they were all found tomorrow. Would this affect the claims in the book? I should also say as a footnote, by the way, that there are people who do claim that there are instances of Benjamin's voice to be heard in one of his radio plays delivered from Cologne, but there's a lot of contention as to whether that is the case, and it's kind of unverifiable. What's interesting about it is that even in that case, the voice takes on a very kind of performative, and he's an actor in that context rather than an academic delivering to an audience. So even in that context, it would be strange, even if we could identify that as Benjamin's voice. So I suppose to respond to this thought experiment of finding the broadcasts, I think it would affect the claims, but I don't think it would contradict them. I think it would actually corroborate them. I think it would make them virtually stronger in a certain sense. Because I think this cuts to the core of something important. So you could call this quite grandly something to do with, let's call it the redemptive translatability of difference. And I mean that in contrast to imitation or copying that's premised on a kind of mourning. So these are obviously kind of themes that touch on well-worn issues in Derrida scholarship, for instance, and thinking about how Derrida interacts with the legacy of Benjamin. But I don't necessarily mean them in that sense. What I'm responding to, I suppose you could say, is that in a lot of scholarship on Benjamin's radio broadcasts, I do think that there is a kind of mournful tendency to desire the lost presence of his voice. And on one level, I absolutely get this. It's quite profound and understandable. What person who's been touched or moved by Benjamin's writings wouldn't want to hear the sound of his voice? But on another level, I think this desire is kind of limiting. What it does is it makes us engage these broadcasts as just or primarily auditory works, even though that's the medium in which they're completely missing. I think, and I explore this in the book, I think this tendencies manifest in the work of some scholars who basically try to imitate concepts from Benjamin's wider corpus and transpose them over to the radio work. For instance, Benjamin discusses the famous optical unconscious in The Little History of Photography and essay in The Work of Art in the Age of Its Technological Reproducibility essay. And his point there is that the camera, very famously, his point is that the camera captures things that the eye doesn't see. And if you think about Zoom, for instance, it allows us to explore what was unconscious in what we thought we were seeing. And scholars rightly have taken that up and thought about an acoustic or acoustical unconscious. Audio recordings like this one contain things that we weren't conscious of, and we can use the podcast or the recording to access that. And and Benjamin talks about that as a kind of psychoanalysis or analogous to psychoanalysis. So the claim that I'm trying to make in the book is that in addition to that kind of mournful tendency, I think we just need to be alive to the capacity to translate this work differently, to take up different things in it, inspirations, bizarre idiosyncratic contingencies, like finding it's about the city you live in, or how children interact with it in visual media, for instance, drawing comic strips in response to it. Yeah, I think that the more profound translatability concerns difference rather than just imitation. So it's about letting something that he didn't expect and that we didn't expect to find in these broadcasts to live on. Um, you know, because we can do different things with them by taking them into schools or sharing them with students or reading them to your children, and take different inspirations from them in that sense.
You spoke about a lot of the scholarship on the radio work, but it's the case that they were neglected for a long time, and a lot of that work was impelled actually by English language scholarship, which has often tended to take the radio plays more seriously than the German, Sabine Schillerberg maybe being the great exception. Could you say something about Benjamin's own attitude towards these shows, and whether in in you making so much of them, you're doing that classic Benjaminian operation of rescuing stuff from oblivion, picking up the scraps, or is there a different dynamic at work?
Yeah. No, brilliant. So I'm definitely doing that. I'd say in the first instance. But on a personal note, I'm kind of letting it be done to me as well. By which I mean, Benjamin writes this work off. So in a letter to Sholem, he says, this is just unscholarly, and it's a job. It pays better, or it's a type of pay that I can take, and it's available to me. Not being able to work in the academy because Frankfurt has refused to allow me to submit my thesis. So you got all these kind of contradictions. But yeah, on a personal note, I suppose what's quite touching about all of that is, thinking about the kind of constraints that I face. In academia, there's this big split between, the dream of research and doing teaching. And you can get really messed up thinking about that division, which takes priority and which you're most ethically kind of bound to. One way of dealing with it would be to say, I'll just do the teaching as a job and I'll try and excel at the research. What I think Benjamin didn't see about his own radio work is that it was his teaching. It was his school, let's say. It's the type of school that someone without a school ends up in. In being in that type of virtual, strange, marginal school, the school is about what schooling involves. In my own work, I was kind of feeling a lot of constraints to do with this division between teaching and research. And I thought to myself, well, what if I just let the teaching inform the research rather than thinking about them being split or thinking about the research informing teaching? So I was kind of trying to take that example from Benjamin. So in sum, I suppose what I'd say is absolutely it's about this redemptive exercise, this peril fishing, as Arendt famously puts it in her essay on Benjamin in Illuminations. It's about rescuing things, namely the radio scripts, but it's also about seeing a practice in them that he didn't see, I don't think. And it has greater translatability than I think that literature on his radio work, whether in English or German, has typically tended to see.
Yeah, when a year ago or so, I published with Sam Dolbear a book, even more about the margins of the margins, about his friend Ernst Schoen and the whole milieu. And it really made me balk against Benjamin's dismissiveness of his own work as a kind of hack work, because, the position that radio had, the possibilities, particularly in Frankfurt, where Ernst Schoen was programming and getting jobs for his childhood friend, Walter Benjamin, they were able to embrace the possibilities of a new medium and push it through things like the listening model and the sort of youth programming that's really, as you show in the cited examples within your text, is so self-reflexive and expansive and opening students up or listeners up to imagining their futures, imagining other futures, imagining other places. There's something immense at work there, and Benjamin's self-criticism in a letter to Sholem is very frustrating and annoying. So, any kind of pushback against that and revealing what I think, in a sense, he also knew, that these were sometimes versions. I mean, you criticize this notion in the book, but there are sort of microcosmic versions of the more macrocosmic ideas in the real published spaces, included within the work. But, at some level, he is working through and working out questions of place and logics of technology and what do we think of literature in an age of mass reproduction. I mean, these things are at work, that there isn't that great separation. I mean, do you have sort of favorite lectures where you wanted to go back to again and again to sort of dig out some of those ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a little short list of my favourites. But just before I do that, could I just, your point about Sholem is interesting there, because it's making me reflect that part of that dismissiveness probably it has to do with the addressee. He's speaking to an elsewhere that he can't occupy, which is to say that the place held by Sholem, both in Benjamin's estimation of him and academically, he was more academically successful. And it makes me think, so Susan Buck-Morss has that quite useful little schema for understanding Benjamin when you think about how he compartmentalized his friends. Three big ones in particular, so you've got Sholem, who's writing that letter dismissing his radio works to Then you've got Adorno, who he definitely would have dismissed the radio works to as well, for different reasons to do with culture industry, etc., or what Adorno and Horkheimer go on to call the culture industry. But then there's another friend, which is Brecht, and he definitely wouldn't have been decrying them, I don't think, in his letters to Brecht, because these are kind of instantiations of quite a Brechtian way of teaching. And it should be said, absolutely, that there's a fourth figure there, perhaps the most important of all of them, which is Asja Lācis, who's informing Benjamin's idea on proletarian pedagogy. And then there's a fifth friend, which is Sean as well. So there's this maybe little cluster of friends in the radio corner that's maybe overshadowed by Scholem and Adorno.
It is very insightful, and also makes me think, though, later, after the war, Adorno's on West German radio every single week, giving his address for a kind of remoral, post-Nazi, denazified public sphere. So these things move in and out of acceptability, I think, including for a figure such as Adorno.
No, absolutely. That's an entirely fair point. Yeah, yeah. He was probably hating every minute of it. Not in terms of the the message, but in terms of the medium, I'd imagine. In terms of so a short list. This is kind of implicit and stitched through the book, but there are maybe four that I could really focus on and just very briefly mention. In the kind of middle chapters of the book, I kind of periodize Benjamin's radio work. I say that in the work that he's doing early, around from 1927, when he does one broadcast, then he's doing work in 1929 and 1930. I talk about this as a kind of evolving practice of place. So he's doing Frankfurt things for Frankfurt and Berlin things for Berlin. The things that he's doing in Berlin, I think, are completely beautiful, and they're definitely informed by his friend Franz Hessel's text, Walking in Berlin, which was published around that time. But two instances of it that are just complete tour de forces are, there's one that is listed in the 2014 Verso collection, Radio Benjamin, which is just a beautiful collection and a really well put together book, I think. That's called Berlin Gutter Snipe, and that's from March 1930. And in that, he has this incredibly beautiful reflection on labyrinths and how displacing they are. And he does extraordinary things there, kind of these really beautiful and complex literary images of labyrinths that are themselves labyrinthine. And he's speaking this out to an audience that can't rewind, as we can, or that can't edit. So these are all just completely lost. There's this kind of like a excessive literary performativity that's so rich in that text. Another text from, so again, March 1930 is called Berlin Toy Tour. And what I found fascinating about this, I comment on it in the book, is basically at the end of this broadcast, he asks children to do something impossible. So, in the book, I make this point. Benjamin is philosophical in the sense that he's coming out of the post-Kantian tradition in German philosophy. He's hugely influenced by Kant and never gives up that avowed influence. And basically, at the end of this broadcast, he asks children to tell adults the meaning of beauty, which is, in Kant's philosophical system is something you cannot do. and so he sets this impossible puzzle at the end of this broadcast, and then you could just imagine it being silence. And I just love the thought that he'd kind of stack it with this depth of philosophical tension, and then just dissolve into the next program. And then if I made two others, one that occurs just at the hinge into his later work, and I described this in the book in terms of an intensified practice of place. So that's where he's giving the same broadcasts for both Frankfurt and Berlin. And what he's doing, to hark back to your point earlier on, is he's finding places and events that are capable of doing that. And what's interesting is you can trace the genesis of it, I think, to one particular broadcast, which is called A Visit to the Brassworks from July 1930. And what he does there is he basically takes young people around this, as the narrator, he takes them around the factory and describes this massive gargantuan factory that's producing all sorts of equipment for the German economy. And at the end of that, he describes how that economy is linked to the world through the canals. And it's very poignant because, he invites his listeners to think about their futures as potential workers or consumers with reference to this factory. And of course, history shows that everyone who heard that had a different future than the one he was envisaging. So that's a very poignant one. Perhaps even more poignant, there's a play which I must say it doesn't feature in my book. So it's called Lichtenberg, a cross section. The reason it doesn't feature is because it's out of scope. Because what I was interested in the book, as we've talked about, was instances where we've got the TypeScript but not the broadcast. What we've got there is a TypeScript that didn't have a broadcast because it was commissioned, it was written, it's perhaps his most finely wrought radio play, but he didn't get to broadcast it at all because of the Nazi ascent in Germany in 1933. So I'd suggest those four, they provide the coordinates for something kind of interesting in terms of the argument of the book. If someone wants like a readable playlist that they can have alongside the book, then those four are the four.
I remember there's something on Lichtenberg where he doodles or scribbles something. It's as if he hears the news of the takeover of the radio station and its curtains, it's up. So it sort of makes it a very poignant lack of transmission. Maybe sort of picking up in a sense on that darker side. We've talked a little bit about Heidegger as a philosopher of technology. Another interlocutor within the book is Carl Schmitt and ideas of sovereignty and exception, which is another context that Benjamin has been read in relation to. Could you say something about why it was important to engage Schmitt in this discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. In chapter one, that's where I engage Schmitt and Heidegger. And what I'm trying to do there is kind of settle the debts of post-Kantian philosophy in Germany. And so this notion of the exception, on the one hand, it kind of harks back to my previous book. And what I was thinking about there wasn't the state of exception as theorized by Schmitt very famously. I was thinking about kind of epistemological exceptions. So things that are technologies, but we don't typically think of them as being technologies. So it was that kind of exception. And in thinking about moving towards this book, I realized, I'm going to have to kind of settle my own debts with this term, exception. It's something that Giorgio Agamben, for instance, takes up in his engagement with both Benjamin and Carl Schmitt. And so, kind of schematically, the way that I put it in chapter one is that there's a violence in Schmitt's notion of the state of exception. Famously, his statement is, "Sovereign is he who decides the state of exception." So, in drawing a limit, who's in and who's out, who's enemy and who's friend, and we demonstrate our sovereignty. Schmitt thinks this is completely vital to political sovereignty, and that liberal politics completely obfuscates that. It attempts to deny this. It attempts to say we can all be friends, and loses sight of this enemy-friend distinction, or sovereign and subject distinction. Metaphysically, so there's a lot of discussion about Schmitt in terms of law and jurisprudence, of course, and there's a lot of discussion in terms of political theory as well. If you cash that out, though, in terms of the history of philosophy, he's making a kind of he's making a move that you could say involves making exceptions. So like metaphysically making them. So through the naming of something as enemy, you create the enemy. That seems to be the kind of type of sovereignty that's at the basis of Schmitt's approach in texts like political theology. In chapter one, what I do is, and it might seem a little clumsy, I say that whereas Schmitt's trying to make exceptions, literally make them, like ex nihilo, what we've got with Heidegger is a situation where there are no exceptions. So every everything we experience is simply a sign of being. So this holistic interconnectedness of all things. And what I see Benjamin doing is, so he's not making exceptions, he's not making no exceptions. What he's doing is he's taking up exceptions. So he's taking up their stories, he's dwelling with them. And this is something that scholars like Sam Weber discuss a lot. Benjamin's willing to dwell with an indeterminacy or a lack of certainty. And that's not something that Schmitt will allow for, is arguably something that Heidegger avoids through a kind of rhapsody on being. What I was trying to do with those three thinkers is kind of triangulate the kind of post-Kantian heritage and also say a little bit more about this kind of pressing concept of the exception.
One of my questions, being, I guess, a non-philosopher, not entirely sure what I am, what does it mean to read Benjamin as a philosopher? I mean, we've got, and you pointed out to me on a previous occasion, Jameson in the Benjamin Files underscoring the dominant interpretation of Benjamin as an anti-philosopher, and then recent work by Peter Gordon talking, as you mentioned before, about pearl fishers and a kind of eclecticism. And the way I've sort of used him has been to legitimate my own dilettantish interdisciplinarity. But I mean, you bring to us a very precisely, carefully read Benjamin as coherently philosophical in some sense. So what does it mean to do that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I should say that I think the power of Benjamin resides in that eclecticism. So I think it resides in not being reducible to being a philosopher. Nevertheless, I think that eclecticism has power for philosophy, that philosophy, if it weren't so conservative, would begin to see and unpick and work through in quite important and powerful ways. So what I'm trying to do is take that eclecticism and argue that what we've got with Benjamin isn't an example of an anti-philosophical thinker, let's say, in the sense of simply a journalist or a literary thinker. What we've got is someone who's deeply informed by the history of philosophy, in ways that are extremely heady. I mean, in his early essay on languages, on the language of man and language as such, there are all sorts of extremely detailed metaphysical distinctions and theological ones that are in the mixing pot there. Then you've got a kind of phenomenological influence. You've got post-Kantian influence as well. So he's steeped in philosophy, but he's also eclectic. So what you've got, I think, is you've got an example of someone who's an extremely demanding philosopher. He's demanding more of philosophy, if I could put it that way. And in the first two chapters, if you take their titles, one is called methodological extremism. That's where I focus on Heidegger and Schmitt and the post-Kantian legacy, and the other is called delicate empiricism. So what you've got there seems completely kind of antonymic. You've got this notion of someone who's completely attentive to issues in history of philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, etc. But you've also got someone who's extremely attentive to the details of things, and I think that's an example of what philosophy ought to be. And if the thing that I'm willing to say, if the thing that involves turns out not to be philosophy, then fair enough. But kind of disciplinarily, I just love the thought of someone being that demanding and that eclectic and that willing to perturb our preconceptions about fields, their limits, the policing of their borders.
I suppose part of this goes also back to his thematic valorization of the fragment, and that, I mean, like Adorno, there's a kind of anti-systematic sort of sense of things, while, as you say, and as you brilliantly express in the book, there is also that methodological understanding and pushing it to its limits and critique within it, but also a commitment to experience, the ephemerality of experience. And you have this line that comes up again and again about a kind of integrity of the ephemeral. But so I suppose, can one be a philosopher then, and yeah, I suppose be anti-systematic
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
way?
No, that's great. Thank you for that. Because what strikes me there is, if you're thinking about system building philosophers, if we looked on Google, the philosopher who would pop up immediately is Hegel. But as I discussed with colleagues here at Dundee, Hegel's much less systematic than Kant is, right? So Kant's the system builder. He's the one that wants to build this, as he calls it, architectonic. And I think what Benjamin understood, so Benjamin makes that point about the integrity of an experience that's ephemeral in an essay on Kant and on the coming philosophy is what it's translated into in English. And what he's claiming there is that Kant, in trying to be a system builder, is a kind of extremist. He extremely wants this system, but he can't have it because experience is this ephemeral historical thing, and so Kant's caught in this tension. And so I think that Benjamin recognizes that, and that in and of itself is a philosophical recognition. And then he cashes that out in his work in all sorts of complex ways. If you look at Kant's philosophy, you find lots of examples, you find lots of thought experiments, you find lots of analogies, similes. You don't find stories, you don't find world building, and I think that those things gesture towards this kind of bridging these two extremes, I suppose you could say, methodological extremism, delicate empiricism. That's quite a problem to set yourself.
What I really like in the book is that you take philosophy out into the world. So it's not, do you know your transcendentalism from your induction, etc. So you take it through a project called Localizing Benjamin into schools. So could you say something about how that works, how that came about?
Yeah, yeah. So the project's called Localizing Philosophy, and the final chapter of the book is simply called Localizing Philosophy. Yeah. So what I should say right at the start is I don't mean provincializing philosophy, and I don't mean making it exclusive. So it's not a Schmittian exercise, in and out. What I mean instead is kind of finding ways to allow philosophy in this kind of eclectic, indeterminate sense that we've been discussing to become less uncanny, to use its uncanniness, so to hit home, so to take the concept of home. What does it mean? How can we interrogate it? One of the kind of initial inspirations for this whole book was that we did a workshop with a group of children in 2018. And I must confess that, as I said at the start, my background's in French philosophy. And so, encountering this text by Benjamin literally did derail me because I thought, right, now, now there's a whole other canon that I need to start interrogating. And um, what kind of gave me an impetus to do this was the fact that these children, the reason we'd given them this broadcast about the Tay Bridge disaster to look at is because we knew that they knew about the disaster. Um, but of course, they didn't know anything about Benjamin. And in working through the broadcast, what they allowed me to see is that what I thought I knew about Benjamin was wrong. I thought he was this kind of remote, austere, untranslatable, irreducibly fragmented thinker. Um, and there was a lot of kind of work on that. So he just seemed very erratic, as I put it in the intro to the book. So we did this workshop, and what struck me based on that is that there was much more potential in what had happened there than could be resolved through one broadcast. So what we decided to do is we decided to kind of take it up. I say we, myself and colleagues in philosophy and education at Dundee, we decided to take it out to local schools. So precisely those local schools where historically they'd know about this event, and we'd have an opportunity to kind of open up some of the speculative or philosophical or eclectic issues there. Um, so yeah, every year since 2020, we've been trying to go out to schools and do work with them on this issue. And what we try and do is we don't try and kind of make this part of the curriculum, and we don't try and talk about the curriculum either. So we don't talk about René Descartes and David Hume, parts of the philosophy curriculum in schools. Instead, what we try to do is we try and figuratively build a bridge between elementary school and high school for these pupils. So we work with these pupils at a moment when they're making that transition between those two stages of learning, and where they're often excited or apprehensive. And we try and ask them to think about what kind of bridge is that? What's involved in a bridge? How do we connect to other people today? We do it through bridges, but we also do it through phones and the internet. How has that changed the way that we see the world? What happens if we think of a phone as less a phone than a radio? So all these kind of strange ways of thinking about the technologies that surround children in their world. Yeah, so we take up the Benjamin inspired work. And basically, I mean, if I could put it like this, what's come through to me based on that work is that these radio broadcasts, I describe them as Benjamin's bridges, basically come to the conclusion that they're not broadcasts. We shouldn't think more on them as things that are lost as audible broadcasts, and we shouldn't just fixate on them as text either. I actually think that there is instances of listening. so they're in the way that they can be explored in classroom settings. What they allow for, what they facilitate, is listening rather than anything else. Listening to what questions these young people at a particular stage in their lives have. So yeah, that's perhaps a long-winded answer, but that's what we've tried to do. We've worked with 2,000 pupils across Scotland to date, and in actual fact, tomorrow we're going to go out and do some more work with them there as well. 2,000 pupils, it on one hand, it sounds a lot if you're local, but it sounds small if you're thinking in terms of government and education as something that is institutional. My response to that in the book is that this is an exercise in translatability. It's not an exercise in scalability. So we're not trying to take a model that then can scale up and everyone in the world suddenly learning about the Tay Bridge disaster. No, the point is, what does your city have that it could reflect on in a similar way? And I think that's Benjamin's provocation.
I love that the radio lectures have afterlife, Nachleben being something that Benjamin thinks about, and it relates to all of that translatability through history and becoming different and new specificities. So your book's in the world and now will have its afterlife, and I hope it touches many. But what comes next for you?
Well, thanks so much. Yeah, I'm writing a book manuscript with my colleague Philippe Lyons, who's a Derrida scholar. His work is in eco-deconstruction, the post-humanities. And the title we have for the book is After the University, teaching in the ruins of technology and nature. And my half draws on Walter Benjamin and what I've done in Bridging Benjamin as well, in two respects. So first off, it takes inspiration from Benjamin's statement in his famous Trauerspiel piece, which he was going to submit to Frankfurt for his habilitation, and wasn't allowed to. And he has this very famous statement, so allegories are in the realm of thinking what ruins are in the realm of things. I was just kind of really perplexed by this statement. What kind of weird teaching is going on there? What I'm going to do in my half of the book is kind of take up a kind of attempt an updating of the author as producer essay. So I'm basically departing from the premise that in the face of, say, generative AI and what it does to the figures of both the author and the producer, there's an even more important third figure in that essay, which is the teacher. So basically the question is, when authors have been liquidated and when producers have been turned into content producers and data providers by algorithms, what could teachers and teachers be? So what kind of responsibility or social purpose is to be found in a new vision of what teachers do? I think they're bridge builders would be the link back to Bridging Benjamin.
So you're continuing with bridging metaphors. They've embedded themselves in your philosophical vocabulary now.
Yeah.
I encourage everyone to read your book. I think it has made a big contribution to Benjamin scholarship. And I mean, one thing we didn't touch on is just the very act of adding to what is an immense pile of work and ongoing work that's coming out. But you genuinely found a original, different, and importantly, really productive way to re-encounter Benjamin. So well done with that.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been a University of Minnesota Press production. The book Bridging Benjamin, A Philosophy of Technology, Place, and Education by Dominic Smith is available from University of Minnesota Press. Thank you for listening.